A 68-year-old widow arrived at an abandoned house on a hill in the Ozarks with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and the wood chisel her dead husband used to carve her name into everything he loved. What she found beneath the floorboards would unbury a 40-year-old lie, destroy the most powerful family in the county, and prove that sometimes the person with nothing left to lose is the only one brave enough to do what everyone else was too afraid to try. If stories like this one speak to you, take a moment and subscribe to this channel because there is more to come. Some people reach the end of everything carrying a leather bag, a little money saved, and the quiet belief that somewhere out there, a new beginning still exists. Dorothea Hargrove reached the end of everything, carrying a cardboard suitcase held shut with packing tape, a wool blanket that smelled like mothballs, and the last drawer of Earl's dresser, and the absolute certainty that no new beginning was waiting for her anywhere. She had looked. There was nothing left to find. My name is Dorothea Hargrove. People call me Dot. I am 68 years old and I have been a widow for 10 months. I say it that way because I learned early that it is easier to state the facts like you are reading from a certificate. Flat, precise, no decoration. When you let the grief show in your voice, people get uncomfortable. They look away. They search for the exit. They say something hollow like, "Time heals all things," or "The Lord works in mysterious ways." As if those words could patch the hole that opens when the person you built 41 years around simply stops being there. Earl Hargrove died on a Tuesday in March. It was not quick. Anyone who says it was quick is being kind or was not in the room. 7 months of hospitals of reports stacked on reports of doctors who spoke about him in the third person, while he was sitting right there, of forms and copays and pharmacy lines, where the woman behind the counter looked at the prescription and then looked at me and said the total out loud like it was nothing. Like it was not the cost of a week of groceries or the electric bill or the last $40 in the checking account. Earl was a carpenter, not the kind who built subdivisions with nail guns and plywood, the kind who worked with his hands on old wood, who could run his thumb along a plank and tell you what species it was, how old, where it had been milled. He built porch rails and mantels and window frames for people who still cared about those things. He made a living, not a fortune, enough to keep a rented house on the south side of Springfield, and a truck that started most mornings, and a life that was small, but built with the same care he put into a dovetail joint. 41 years of that life. 41 years of his hands smelling like sawdust and linseed oil when he came through the door. 41 years of his voice slightly off-key singing hymns he half remembered while he swept the shop floor. That man was erased slowly while I watched and could do nothing to stop it. When the hospice nurse finally told me it was over, she touched my shoulder and said he had passed peacefully. And I stood in the hallway holding the pair of wooden house slippers he had carved himself years ago, the ones that were still under the hospital bed, because I had brought them thinking he might walk again, and I thought, no, peaceful is not the word. But I did not say it. I nodded. I thanked her. I put the slippers in my bag and walked out through that wide corridor, carrying a weight that no one else would ever pick up again. I did not cry for 4 days. When I finally did, it was alone in the bathroom with the faucet running so the walls would not hear. The house we rented was small. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that fit 1 person at a time, a backyard with a hackberry tree that dropped berries on the roof every September. $780 a month, which was already more than comfortable on what Earl brought in, and which became impossible once he stopped bringing anything in at all. While he was sick, I tried everything: cleaning houses, hemming pans for a dry cleaner who paid cash under the table, selling what we had at yard sales on Saturday mornings, where strangers picked through our life and offered $1 for things that had taken years to collect. The money that came in left faster swallowed by prescriptions by gas to drive to the hospital by the food I brought him, because the meals they served looked like punishment. When he died, I was 3 months behind on rent. The landlord waited exactly 30 days, not out of decency. He waited because the law required it. On the 31st day, he appeared with a paper in his hand and a face that was trying to look embarrassed but was really just impatient. He gave me 2 weeks. I said, "All right," just like that. No anger, no tears, no scene. All right. As though it were normal. As though the last floor I had to stand on was not collapsing beneath my feet while I watched. The friends disappeared. Not all at once. The way a tide pulls back without announcing it. While Earl was alive, some came with visits with casseroles, with words that were meant to help. After the funeral, they thinned. After the first month, they were mostly gone. Not from cruelty, from fear. Fear of another person's sadness. Fear of not knowing what to say. Fear of seeing yourself in someone else's disaster. I understood, but understanding does not fill a table. Earl's family surprised me, and not in the good way. They came to the funeral dressed well, wearing the expression of people who are grieving, but also paying close attention to what is left behind. His brother walked through the house looking at things the way an appraiser walks through a property. His sister-in-law embraced me with one of those long theatrical hugs that have no warmth in them, but last long enough for everyone in the room to see. The father-in-law asked about Earl's tools. Earl had a fine set. Chisels, hand planes, marking gauges, a brace, and bit set from the 1950s that he had rebuilt himself. Years of collecting one piece at a time, kept in a steel chest. They took the chest before I was asked if I might keep it. Then they took the television because Earl had promised it to a nephew. Then the cast iron skillets because apparently those had belonged to their grandmother and had sentimental value. I let it go. I did not have the energy to fight. And somewhere beneath the silence that cuts like a blade, I knew that fighting would not bring Earl back. When they left, the house was emptier than when they arrived. It was then that the letter came. Not from a bank, not from a collector. It came from a county courthouse in a part of southern Missouri I had barely heard of. Taney County. It informed me that Dorothea May Hargrove was listed as the beneficiary of the estate of one Wallace Eugene Fenton, deceased through my spouse Earl Hargrove, who had been identified as an indirect descendant of the deceased through a collateral family line. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. There was a real property asset available. A rural parcel in the hills east of Briar Hill, Missouri. Frame house, 9 acres, no record of habitation or use in over 25 years. No estimated market value, the document said with that bureaucratic coldness that means this is what was left after everyone who wanted something already took it. Earl had never told me about this relative. Maybe he did not know. Maybe he knew and did not think it mattered. He was not a man who talked much about his father's side of the family. It was a complicated history that he always said he would explain later, and later never came. I spoke with a legal aid attorney who gave me 15 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon. He looked at the document, adjusted his glasses, and said with the tired honesty of a man who has seen too many people in my chair, "Ma'am, the property is yours by right, but it is remote. There is no confirmed infrastructure, and there is no commercial value to speak of. If you want to sell it, good luck finding a buyer. If you want to live there, it is an option. An option. As though I had others." I asked what it would cost to transfer the title. He told me a number that was more than I had, but there was an alternative. With the documents and an affidavit of financial hardship, I could begin a process of adverse possession which would give me the right to occupy while the paperwork moved through the system. I walked out carrying a folder of papers under my arm, and the feeling that this house I had never seen on a hill I had never climbed was now the only place on earth where I had the right to be. I left Springfield on a morning of thin rain. The cardboard suitcase fit in the luggage bay. I brought the blanket, 3 changes of clothes. The pots that Earl's family had not wanted, because they were cheap, a kitchen knife, Earl's wood chisel that they had left behind because the handle was cracked, and they did not know what it was worth, and a box of provisions, rice, canned beans, salt, cooking oil, sugar, 2 cans of tuna, and a sleeve of saltine crackers. I did not say goodbye to anyone because there was no one left to say it to. The bus left me in Briar Hill after 2.5 hours on a road that got narrower as it went. From there, I caught a ride with a man driving a feed truck up toward the ridge. He was large, quiet, with one elbow resting on the window ledge and the radio turned low to a station playing old country. Halfway up, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a wax paper bundle. Sandwich. He held it toward me without looking. I took half because I was hungry and because sometimes kindness arrives exactly when you have stopped expecting it. He let me off where the paved road ended and a dirt track began. "From here you go straight up," he said, pointing to a path that climbed between rows of eastern red cedar. "The house is before the old quarry." I thanked him. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap and drove on without ceremony. It was a mile and a half of climbing on a Wednesday afternoon, with no one in sight carrying everything I still owned in the world. The ground was red clay, loose gravel, and exposed rock. The wind came down cold from the ridge, carrying the smell of wet leaves and turned earth, and something faintly mineral that I would later learn was the limestone shelf that ran beneath the entire hill. Every few minutes a bird screamed from the trees, a long, sharp cry that sounded like a question. "What are you doing here?" Good question. I could not have answered it clearly. I only knew I needed ground beneath my feet, any ground, and this was the only ground that had my name on it. I saw the house before I reached it. It appeared first as a dark shape between the cedars, then as a mass of wall and roof that the overgrown brush almost concealed. When I reached the gate, a heavy wooden frame hanging crooked on rusted hinges, I stopped and stood looking for a long time. It was larger than I had imagined. That was both a relief and a fright. Larger meant more room, but also more rot, more collapse, more labor for a woman alone trying to hold something together that had been falling apart for decades. The walls were wood frame construction with clapboard siding that had long since lost whatever paint it once carried. The exposed wood was gray and split, streaked with dark moss and the green stain of years of rain running down surfaces that no one wiped. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted in long streaks, with at least 5 or 6 places where the panels had buckled or slipped. A gutter hung loose on the east side, swinging in the wind like a broken arm. The windows were old double-hung frames, some warped open, one shattered entirely, with a piece of cardboard nailed over the gap from inside, which meant someone had been here at some point, if only to make that one repair and leave again. The yard was a field of tall grass, ironweed, and creeping thistle. The remains of a fence that once separated a front garden from the broader acreage were nothing but rotted posts and loose wire. In the corner, a sycamore tree had grown at an angle, leaning its pale trunk over the porch roof, as though pressing its ear against the house to listen. I pushed the gate. It groaned on its hinges like it resented the intrusion. I walked through. The path to the front door was a carpet of dead leaves mixed with mud and moss. I climbed the 2 stone steps to the porch, holding my suitcase with both hands, because the second step was cracked down the middle, and I did not trust it with my full weight. The front door was closed with an old padlock that had rusted into the hasp. It took me 10 minutes of working with the key the county office had sent with the documents. When the lock finally gave, it opened with a dry crack that echoed through the empty house like a gunshot in a church. I pushed the door open. Inside it smelled like stop time. That is the only way I know to describe it. Not just mildew, though. There was mildew. Something deeper. As though the air itself had aged in there, accumulating decades of silence, of absence, of things left behind and forgotten. A smell that came from the bare rooms, from the plaster walls, from the wooden floor darkened by years of nothing. I stepped in slowly. The front room was larger than I expected for a house this old in this part of the country. High ceiling with exposed beams, a floor of wide planks, some bowed with moisture, others loose at the edges. The walls showed the outlines where pictures had once hung, and in one corner the remains of a cabinet had collapsed inward. Its doors open at impossible angles like the arms of someone too tired to hold on. I crossed into the kitchen, a cast-iron wood stove covered in rust and soot, a stone sink cracked through the basin, a small window looking out to the back where a single okra plant had grown up wild and stubborn among the weeds, absurd and alive, as if it did not need anyone's permission to exist. There were two bedrooms. The back one was completely empty. The front one had a thin mattress leaning against the wall stained yellow, and a wooden chair with its seat broken through the middle. The bathroom was outside around the back, which meant that at night I would have to walk out to use it. I returned to the front room, set my suitcase on the floor, stood in the center of the room, and looked around and tried to find inside myself something that resembled hope. Something that could tell me this was going to work, that I would manage, that I would survive here. I did not find hope. I found exhaustion. I found the hunger beginning to press against my stomach. I found the cold sliding in through the warped window frame. But I also found at the bottom of all that tiredness a determination without a name. The kind of thing that is not exactly courage and not exactly resignation. Something more primitive than both. The instinct of a person who has learned that crying does not warm the floor. And that night will come whether you are ready for it or not. So I went to gather wood. That first night was the hardest I had lived through since the day I walked out of that hospital with Earl's slippers in my bag. I did not sleep on the old mattress. There were stains I preferred not to investigate by lamplight. I folded the blanket on the floor of the front room near the most sheltered corner of the wall, where the draft from the crooked window did not reach directly. I boiled water on the wood stove, which took a long time because the firewood was damp, and made weak tea with a single bag I had brought in my coat pocket. I sat against the wall with the cup between my hands and watched the flame in the oil lamp I had found in the kitchen still half full, as though whoever left it had expected someone to come back eventually and need the light. The wind pressed against the windows with a persistence that felt personal. The house groaned. Every stronger gust made the floorboards respond with a creak, as if the entire structure were having a conversation in a language I could not yet understand. I thought about Earl, not out of habit, not out of nostalgia. I thought about him the way you think about someone when thinking is a form of duty, as though remembering could keep him existing somewhere in some form a little longer. I remembered the last real night we spent together before the hospital, before everything became a blur of test results and treatment protocols, and words like prognosis that sound clinical until they are about someone you love. He had fallen asleep holding my hand, did not say anything, did not need to. Just his hand around mine, warm rough from decades of wood and tools holding on the way. He always held on to things quietly and completely. I had felt that hand go cold. That is not the kind of thing you can describe to someone who has not lost a person that way. You are there holding the hand, and the hand changes and you know what it means. But you do not let go because letting go would be accepting. And accepting is not possible yet. Not in that moment, not in that hour. And when you finally do let go, when the nurse gently touches your shoulder and says it is over, you walk away carrying the feeling that you left something behind that you will never be able to go back for. I swallowed. That memory blew out the lamp and tried to sleep. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A sound from below. Not the wind, not the groaning of the beams overhead. This came from underneath the floor. A hollow, low creaking as though something beneath the planks was settling or shifting or waiting. It had a rhythm to it that wind does not have. It was too even, too deliberate, too much like a voice trying to be heard through a wall of wood and earth and time. I lay still in the dark with my heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. I waited. The sound came again, then silence. Then again. After a while my heart settled and exhaustion pulled me under. I slept with Earl's wood chisel within reach of my right hand, not because I believed in ghosts. I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in men. And on that remote hill alone in a house that no one knew was mine, caution was the closest thing to companionship I had. Morning came through the crooked window in yellow angles that lit up the dust floating in the air, like something released. I lay looking at the dark beams above me. I breathed in. I got up. I did what I have always done when the pain tries to hold me still. I started working. I heated water. I made thin coffee with the last of what I had. I ate 2 saltine crackers. Then I took the broom I found leaning in the kitchen corner, its bristles more scarecrow than sweeper. and began cleaning the front room. The dust was years deep. Gray clouds rose with every stroke, making me cough until I opened every window that would open and swept everything out the front door. I pushed the collapsed cabinet into the corner. I scrubbed the kitchen sink with sand and creek water until it was usable. I worked through the entire morning. By noon, my arms ached and my left knee throbbed, an old injury from a fall years ago while cleaning office buildings. Wet floor, the mop bucket tipped the long hallway suddenly beneath me. The employer paid for the doctor and the 2 weeks off because he was required to then let me go the following month, because he could not risk another incident. I was dismissed with a severance that barely covered rent. I do not carry anger about it. I carry only the memory of a knee that reminds me every morning that the body keeps a record of everything that was asked of it beyond what it should have been. I sat on the porch and ate rice I had cooked that morning. I looked at the enormous yard, at the tall weeds, at the leaning sycamore, and thought that I would need at least 3 months to bring that land into any kind of order. 3 months I did not have because the food would run out long before then. In that moment, for the first time since arriving, I felt the real weight of what I had done. I had come to a remote place with no money, no neighbors I knew, no plan beyond surviving. The stubbornness that had carried me here was the same stubbornness that had kept me standing through the months before. But stubbornness does not plant food or fix a roof. One day at a time. That was what Earl used to say when things got hard. One day at a time, dot. Do not try to solve everything at once. Solve what is in front of you today. What was in front of me today was the yard needing clearing, the roof needing patching, and the pantry needing filling. I had no brush cutter, no roofing material, and no money to buy either. But I had the chisel, and I had my arms. I started with the yard. It was a neighbor named Geneva Phelps who found me that afternoon. I was turned away, hacking at the ironweed with the kitchen knife and the chisel handle, when I heard a voice behind me. "Hello there." I spun around with the knife raised before I could think. She stood on the other side of the half-collapsed fence, a small woman in her mid-70s, wiry and brown from decades of sun, wearing a straw hat with a frayed brim and an expression balanced precisely between curiosity and caution. She carried a cloth sack in one hand. "Easy now," she said, not at all impressed by the knife. "I am Geneva. I live down at the bend. Saw smoke yesterday and this morning and thought somebody has moved into the Fenton place." I lowered the knife. "I am Dorothea. The house came to me through an inheritance." She studied me for a moment with small dark eyes that seemed to measure people with a precision born from long practice. The look of someone who has lived enough years to learn quickly who is worth trusting and who is not. Then, without further conversation, she held out the cloth sack. "Brought you some eggs. There is a butternut squash in my garden too heavy for me to carry up here. You come get it when you are ready." I could not answer immediately. When you go a long time without receiving kindness, it catches you off guard. It catches you in the throat, in the place where you stored all the tears you swallowed over the past months. "Thank you," I said. The voice came out different than I intended. Geneva waved her hand as though brushing away the gratitude. "This house has been alone too long," she said, looking past me at the structure behind. "It needed someone." She left down the dirt path without ceremony, the way people leave when they have work waiting. And the conversation has already said what it needed to say. I watched her go and thought that sometimes the world sends a message. Not with grand words, not with dramatic signs. It sends it with a cloth sack of eggs and a squash too heavy for an old woman to carry uphill. On the third night, the creaking returned. This time, it would not let me sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the wind in the windows. The beams groaning overhead and beneath those familiar sounds, that other one. Lower, deeper, coming from below the floor. Hollow and insistent, as though something buried had waited 25 years, and now, with someone finally present to hear it, had decided the time had come. I lit the oil lamp. The small wavering flame illuminated the old floor. The wide planks darkened by time, some bowed in the center, others loose at the ends. I knelt. I tapped the floor with my knuckles near the middle of the room. The sound came back hollow. I tapped the plank beside it, solid. I returned to the first, hollow again. I pressed my ear almost to the wood and held still. Nothing. Only the silence of the house, the wind outside my own heartbeat loud in my ear. But there was something there. I knew it. Not intuition, not anything supernatural. Simple logic. An air cavity beneath specific planks does not appear by accident in old houses. Someone had made that space on purpose. I went back to the blanket, lay down, stared at the ceiling, slept badly, woke with the day still gray outside, and that thought fixed in my head like a nail driven into hardwood. What is under the floor of this house? I did not rush. I lay on the blanket for several minutes organizing my thoughts the way you organize tools before a job. I had learned that discipline from Earl. He said that work done in haste is work done twice. He was a carpenter. He knew what a careless decision could cost. I got up slowly. The left knee protested as it always did on cold mornings. I lit the stove, heated water, drank thin coffee standing at the cracked stone sink, looking out through the small kitchen window at the backyard where the lone okra plant swayed slightly in the early wind. I ate the last 2 crackers. Then I took the kitchen knife, Earl's wood chisel, and went to the front room. In the daylight, the floor looked different from the night before. Less mysterious, more ordinary. Just old wood, dark with age marked by decades of use and neglect. The hollow sound I had found could have a dozen simple explanations. Wood shrinkage, a gap caused by moisture pulling a plank away from its joist. Something any carpenter would explain in 30 seconds. I knelt in the same spot, tapped. The hollow was still there. I ran my fingers along the edge of the plank looking for a grip, a ridge, any point of purchase. The plank was wide about 10 inches, and it was set differently from the others. The neighboring planks were fixed with old square-head nails, whose rounded tops sat flush with the surface. This plank had no nails along its side edges. It rested on the joists but was not fastened, like a lid. I worked the blade of the kitchen knife into the crack on the left edge. The wood resisted. It was swollen with moisture, sealed tight by time, as though the years had soldered it shut. I pressed harder. The blade was thin and old, and for a moment I feared it would snap before the plank moved. But the wood began to shift. 1 millimeter. 2, the edge lifting slightly, the resistance easing as the seal broke. I switched to Earl's chisel. It had more width, more strength. I used it as a lever. The plank came free with a dry crack that echoed through the empty room like a bone breaking. I knelt motionless, holding the plank up with both hands. Below was darkness. I waited for my eyes to adjust. The daylight from the windows did not reach directly into the space between the floor and the earth. I brought the oil lamp close. The soil underneath was dark, almost black, different from the red clay of the surrounding land. And it was disturbed. Not compacted the way soil would be after decades of resting undisturbed. It had been turned, not recently, but not as long ago as the house itself. Someone had broken this earth deliberately, prepared it to receive something, and then time had only partially smoothed the evidence. I reached into the gap, about 6 inches of clearance between the plank and the soil, enough to store things, enough to hide things. I began to dig with my fingers. The earth gave easily crumbly and slightly damp without the hardness of virgin ground. Someone had worked this soil before me. 4 inches down, 8. My fingers touched something solid. I stopped, breathed, resumed digging more carefully, brushing the dirt to the sides with slow movements, the way you unwrap something that might be fragile. A cloth bundle emerged. Heavy fabric, dark, tied at the ends with rough twine, the kind used to bind bundles of clothing in small towns decades ago. I pulled it free slowly. It came out resisting, as though the earth did not want to let go. It was heavy for its size, about the size of a brick, maybe slightly larger. I set it on the floor by the lamp. The cloth was stained with dirt but intact. The twine had hardened but had not rotted. Whoever had wrapped this had thought about durability, had thought that someone would one day find it. I untied the knot, opened the cloth. Inside was a small leather pouch closed with a leather strap wound several times around it. The leather was stiff and darkened by years but firm, intact. I unwound the strap, opened the pouch. Coins, many coins, old heavy. Some with the dull color of aged bronze, others still showing a faint gleam beneath the dark patina of time. I poured several into my palm and held them near the lamp. They were old. I could see that much. 1950s, maybe 40s, maybe earlier. Some had faces I did not recognize. Others had inscriptions in English with typefaces from another era. I looked at those coins in my open hand for a long time. The first thought was immediate and automatic. The thought of a person who has counted every dollar for years. These might be worth money. But the second thought came right behind it. The thought that persists when you were raised to consider consequences. Whose are these? And why were they buried under a floor? I put the coins back in the pouch, set it aside, and kept digging. There was more. Beside where the pouch had been, the earth concealed another object. A tin box oval with a fitted lid, the kind manufactured in the 1960s. The lid was rusted at the edges, but the tin was intact, sealed, preserving whatever was inside from the moisture that had been working at everything else in this house for decades. I pried the lid with the chisel. It gave with a sound like a small gasp, as if the air inside had been held for 40 years and was only now allowed to leave. Inside were documents, papers folded carefully in layers, some wrapped in thin yellowed plastic. The kind of improvised protection someone invents when they do not have a proper archive, but need to preserve what they have. There were also letters folded in half, sealed with darkened wax that time had hardened to stone, and a notebook. A hardcover notebook, black the size of a small book. The cover was warped by moisture but intact. A name on the spine, written by hand in ink that had faded but was still legible. W. Fenton, 1979. I sat back on my heels. Wallace Fenton, the same name from the courthouse document. The man whose house had become mine. The man from whom Earl had descended through some collateral line that was never explained to me because Earl always said he would tell me that story later, and later never came. With hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of holding something that carried history inside it, I opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was firm, slanted, the kind of penmanship that men of my grandfather's generation learned in rural schoolhouses with rulers and discipline. A script that had been taught with rigor, and that over the years had acquired its own personality, with the loops on the G and J wider than standard, with the dots on the I slightly forward, as though the hand was always one step ahead of what it was writing. There was a date on the first line, March 12th, 1979, and below it, without preamble, without introduction. I'm writing this because I need to leave a record somewhere other than my own memory. Since my memory can die with me, and they know that. My name is Wallace Eugene Fenton. I am 43 years old and I was born on this land. My father was from here. My grandfather was from here. My great-grandfather was the one who cleared the timber and raised this house with his own hands. I am not a thief. I have never been a thief. What happened at the cooperative was not my doing, and I will prove it, or I will die trying. I stopped reading. I looked toward the window. The daylight had advanced while I was kneeling on that floor, and now the morning was full and bright with the sun cutting low through the open shutters. I closed the notebook carefully, not because I did not want to read more, because I knew that what was written inside was too large to be read in haste, kneeling on a cold floor, hungry with aching knees and dirt under my fingernails. It deserved full attention. It deserved respect. I set the notebook back in the tin. I set the tin beside me. I kept digging because something told me there was more. There was. A third cache deeper, nearly 20 inches below the floor, in a space that had been excavated with tools. The walls of the cavity showed clean cuts, not the rough marks of hands. Someone had worked with care, with method like a man building a vault that the earth would guard better than any bank. Inside was an envelope large bound with twine containing not letters but documents, receipts with signatures, carbon copy minutes from cooperative meetings, a ledger page with entries and names, and at the bottom, a signed statement from a man whose name I did not yet know, but would come to know well, a statement declaring that he had been pressured to sign falsified records. I gathered everything with care: the leather pouch, the tin with the notebook and documents, the envelope with the formal papers. I carried it all to the kitchen table, the only clean surface I had managed to prepare the day before, and I stood there looking at it. Then I turned back to the front room. I looked at the open plank, at the dark earth below, at the cavity that had held these things for decades. The floor around it was still and silent. No creaking, no hollow sound. As though the house, having finally been heard, had said what it needed to say and was now waiting with a different kind of patience. The patience of something that knows the work has begun. I went back to the kitchen. I cooked rice and beans. I fried 2 of the eggs Geneva had brought me the way my mother used to, when she wanted to make the simplest meal feel like something more. I ate slowly, standing at the sink, looking out the small window at the wild yard, thinking. There were 2 realities I needed to face at the same time. The first was immediate. Those old coins probably had value. Collector coins, depending on rarity and condition, could be worth enough to buy food for months, to patch the roof, to purchase seed for planting. Enough to stop depending on the generosity of Geneva Phelps or the luck of a single okra plant that had decided to grow without permission. The second reality was heavier. Those coins were not alone. They were buried with documents, with a notebook of confessions, with the record of a man who had hidden beneath his own floor the only proof that he was not what they said he was. These 2 realities did not fit together simply. You do not open the first and ignore the second. Or at least I could not, because I had been the woman who walked out of a hospital carrying her dead husband's handcuffed slippers, refusing to let a man be reduced to a chart number. And if I did that for Earl, how could I do less for a stranger who had buried beneath his floorboards the only chance that someone might one day know he was not a thief? I washed my plate, dried my hands, sat down at the table, opened the notebook of Wallace Fenton, and on the last page, in handwriting that had lost the steadiness of the earlier pages but was still legible, I found the words that would change the direction of everything that followed. I do not know who will find this. I do not know when. But if you are reading this, it means the house is still standing, and that alone is more than I had the right to hope. Keep these papers, use them or guard them, but do not let them die. I made many mistakes in my life, as every man does, but theft was not one of them. And my daughter, Lucille Fenton, does not deserve to spend the rest of her life believing her father was a thief. If you have any kindness in you, do this for her. Not for me, for her. I closed the notebook. I sat in the kitchen chair in the silence of the afternoon, with the hill country sun coming long and low through the small window, and I was quiet for a time I could not measure. I did not cry. Swallowing tears had become so automatic in me that sometimes I did not even notice I was doing it. But something inside me had shifted. A quiet rearrangement. The way a problem you have been staring at from one angle suddenly reveals another angle you did not see before. I had arrived at this house with nothing, and now I held in my hands the only thing a dead man had left behind: the truth. The question was no longer whether I would use those coins to survive. The question was how I would do both things at the same time: survive and do what the man had asked. Because I knew, sitting there with the notebook closed on the table and the last light of the afternoon falling across the floorboards, that they would come asking what I had found, and I would not be able to lie. I have never been good at lying, and even if I were, I was not going to start now. That night, for the first time since I arrived on the hill, the creaking beneath the floor was silent. The wind pressed the windows the same way. The beams groaned overhead the same way. The cold of the Ozark night descended the same way. But that hollow, insistent sound that had kept me awake for 2 nights running was gone, as though the house had finally been heard. I lay on the blanket with my eyes on the ceiling and thought about Lucille Fenton, the daughter of a dead man who had spent decades believing her father was a thief. I thought about Earl, who had been reduced to a chart number on the day he most needed to be a whole man. I thought about myself, who had been reduced to a debt that could not be paid. And I thought that the world has a way of burying people while they are still alive. But it also has a way sometimes of handing someone the tool to dig them back up. I closed my eyes. I slept with the notebook on the kitchen table, the documents beside it, and the decision forming slowly, silently, the way water fills a vessel without a sound, until suddenly it is full. I read for 3 hours without stopping. The handwriting in the notebook was steady through the first 30 pages. The penmanship of a man who still believed that putting the truth on paper was enough to make it matter. Wallace Fenton had been born in that house in 1936. His father had been born in it before him. His grandfather had cleared the timber and raised the walls with hand-hewn oak, and the land had passed from one generation to the next. The way land does when people believe it is not something you own, but something you hold for the ones who come after. Wallace married a woman named Ruth when he was 23. Ruth died in childbirth when their daughter Lucille was 2 years old. He raised the girl alone. The notebook said this with an economy of words that told me more than a chapter of details ever could. I raised my daughter the best way I knew how, and I hope she understands one day. That was all. A single line carrying the weight of 14 years of mornings and meals and homework and silence in a house built for more people than were left in it. In the early 1970s, Wallace became a founding member of the Briar Hill Agricultural Cooperative alongside 11 other small farmers from the surrounding hills. The idea was simple and sound. Pool the purchasing of seed and fertilizer, negotiate collectively for better prices at market share equipment that no single farmer could afford alone. For several years it worked. The members trusted each other. The books were open at every monthly meeting. Money moved in and out with transparency. Until the Kessler family decided they wanted the land. Wallace never wrote the full name. He wrote only the Kesslers, the way you refer to a force of nature that does not need further identification, because everyone in its path already knows what it is. They were the largest landowners in the county, had been for 3 generations, and their method of expansion was patient and methodical. They bought when they could persuade. They pressured when they could not. They waited for debt and desperation to do the work for them, picking off one small farmer at a time, the way a current pulls stones from a bank one by one until the whole bank collapses. But the cooperative, as long as it held together, was a wall they could not get past. 12 farmers standing together, had market access, negotiating power, and the collective stubbornness of people who had watched their fathers and grandfathers hold the same ground. So the Kesslers changed strategy. In 1977, the cooperative's treasurer, a man named Emmett Pryor, began diverting funds, small amounts at first, then larger ones. When the hole grew too large to hide, the Kesslers made their move. They pointed at Wallace. He was the president, the face, the most respected, the most stubborn in refusing their offers. Therefore, the one who needed to be destroyed for the land grabbed to proceed. The accusation was swift and precise. Wallace Fenton had embezzled cooperative funds for personal gain. The Kesslers had influence at the courthouse, with the sheriff, with the county board. Evidence was manufactured with efficiency. Emmett Pryor signed a statement claiming he had acted on Wallace's orders. Witnesses materialized from nowhere. Wallace was never formally charged because the evidence was enough to ruin him, but not enough to convict. Which meant the goal had never been prison. The goal was destruction, and destruction was achieved. The cooperative members, afraid of guilt by association, scattered. Several sold their land to the Kesslers within months, in the desperate haste of people who want distance from another man's disgrace. The cooperative dissolved. Wallace lost his reputation, his friends, his livelihood. He also lost Lucille. She was 12 when it happened. She grew up in Briar Hill, carrying the mark of being the thief's daughter. At 16, she left. The notebook said only she went away with the contained pain of a father who understands but cannot stop the wound from bleeding. Wallace stayed on the hill alone. He spent his remaining years gathering what evidence he could salvage. Copies of meeting minutes that showed inconsistencies in the financial records. Receipts that contradicted the official version. A signed statement from a man named Virgil Pomeroy, the cooperative's bookkeeper, declaring he had been coerced into falsifying documents. Letters that some of the former members sent him secretly admitting they knew the truth but were too afraid to speak. And when his health began to fail, the last pages of the notebook, mentioning a persistent cough that the doctors in town called serious without saying what it was, he made a decision. He buried everything beneath the floor. Not so it would rot. So it would be found. The handwriting on those final pages, which I had already read once by lamplight, hit differently the second time. Slower, heavier, every word carrying the full weight of a man who had spent his last years preparing a message for a future he would not see. The loops on the letters had widened the lines, slanting more steeply, the hand losing control but not stopping, never stopping. I closed the notebook, set it on the table beside the tin and the envelope, sat in the silence of the kitchen for a long time while the afternoon light moved across the wall and the shadow of the sycamore outside lengthened across the porch. There was a decision to make and I had already made it. What remained was preparation. I spent the next day copying by hand onto the back of a feed store flyer I found in the bottom of my suitcase every name, every date, every figure that appeared in the documents. Not because the originals needed backup, they were intact, but because I wanted to understand what I was carrying before I showed it to anyone. I had learned through years of sitting across from people who had authority over my life. Landlords, bill collectors, intake clerks at county offices. That when you arrive in front of someone with power and do not understand what you are holding, they see it in your face, and what you carry loses weight before it is even heard. On the morning of the third day, I packed what I needed. A clean blouse, the tin wrapped in cloth inside the sack Geneva had given me. The notebook wrapped separately in the plastic bag that had held the saltines. The leather pouch of coins because I would not leave them alone in a house without a proper lock while I was gone for hours. The walk down the hill was easier than the climb up had been. I knew now where the loose stones lay, where the path narrowed near the gully, where the cedar branches hung low enough to catch the top of a sack if you were not paying attention. Halfway down at the bend, where the trail opened briefly to a view of the valley, an armadillo appeared at the edge of the tree line. Paused, looked at me with the ancient indifference of an animal that has survived by curling into a ball when the world gets dangerous, and shuffled back into the brush. I smiled. I do not know why. Maybe because an animal whose entire defense strategy is to roll up and endure felt like appropriate company that morning. At the junction with the paved road, I waited 40 minutes before a vehicle appeared. A mud-spattered pickup hauling rolls of wire fencing, driven by a young man who looked at me with suspicion when I asked for a ride. I told him I lived at the house on the hill. The Fenton place, he said, the way people say a name that needs no address. That one I said. He looked at me a moment longer, then tilted his head toward the cab. Get in. Briar Hill was a town with one traffic light that blinked yellow on all four sides. A pharmacy, a general store, a gas station with two pumps, a diner. Called Railings with a screen door that did not close all the way. And the kind of courthouse square where the same people have been crossing paths on the same sidewalks for 50 years. It also had, I discovered from a line in the county paperwork, a law office. Mendon and Associates, said the sign painted directly onto the brick wall of a two-story building on the street behind the courthouse. Below the name in smaller letters, General Practice Land Law Probate. I climbed the steps. The door was open. A waiting room with 4 plastic chairs, a reception desk staffed by a young woman who was reading a magazine with the posture of someone serving a sentence, and a desk fan turning slowly with no visible effect on the heat. The young woman looked up without lifting her head. "Can I help you?" I would like to see Mr. Mendon, I said. It is about a property and about old documents I found. They concern an accusation from 1978 that may be able to be overturned. She looked at me with more attention than before. Let me check if he is available. Arthur Mendon was a man in his early 60s with the permanent exhaustion of someone who has spent a career listening to other people's problems and has developed an immunity to surprise. His office was a small room at the end of a hallway stacked with folders, with a larger fan in the window and a framed photograph on the wall of himself, 20 years younger, shaking hands with a state legislator whose name I did not recognize. He indicated the chair across from his desk. I sat. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. You said you have documents from 1978. I do. And I want to know if they are sufficient to prove that a dead man was not a thief. And if they are, I want to know how to make that happen. Something moved across his face. Quick, almost invisible. But it was there. Where did these come from? Under the floorboards of the house I inherited. Wallace Fenton's house. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with the tail of his shirt, put them back on. In this town, Mrs. Hargrove, everyone over 50 knew Wallace Fenton, or thought they did. There was something in that sentence that was not just information. It was a door left partly open. I pushed. And you, Mr. Mendon, what did you think? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer, took out a legal pad and a pen. Tell me from the beginning. I spoke for nearly an hour. He listened without interrupting. He made notes in a square, practical hand. When I finished, he sat quiet for a time, then asked about the Virgil Pomeroy statement. The man who was coerced into signing false records, I said. His statement has a notary stamp. County of Christian, 1980. Virgil Pomeroy passed away 12 years ago. That cooled something in me. And Emmett Pryor, I said, the treasurer who made the accusation, dead, 8 years, heart attack. And the Kesslers. The pause was longer this time. The elder Kessler died in 2020. Mendon said carefully. But there are sons, grandchildren, and an attorney who still represents the family's interests. I understood. So there are still people who benefit from the old story staying exactly as it is. He neither confirmed nor denied. He took off his glasses again and placed them flat on the desk. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, in the tone of someone about to say something the other person will not enjoy hearing. But that needs to be said regardless. What you have here is substantial, more than I would have expected to survive this long. The Pomeroy statement, if it can be authenticated through the original notary record, is particularly significant. The meeting minutes with the financial discrepancies also. This could, in theory, support a petition for posthumous rehabilitation of Wallace Fenton's name. But, a posthumous rehabilitation is not simple. It requires research, additional documentation. A petitioner with recognized legal standing, meaning a family member with direct interest. And it costs. Not a fortune in absolute terms, but for someone without resources, it costs enough to be impossible. I said nothing. He continued. Additionally, the Kessler family still has influence in this area. Not the power they once had. Times have changed. But enough influence to make the process uncomfortable for whoever pursues it. You are telling me you will not help. I am telling you I need to think. He paused. And I am telling you that there is someone who might be better positioned than I am. He wrote a name and phone number on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. Colton Bridger. Had an internship with me 6 years ago. Has his own practice now in Joplin. Young, stubborn. Specializes in rural land law and historical property disputes. This kind of case might interest him more than the fee. It was not a guarantee. It was a referral. The distance between those two things is enormous when you have nothing. But it was what I had. There was a payphone at the gas station on the edge of town that still worked. I know that sounds like it belongs to another century, but in rural Missouri there are still payphones at gas stations and courthouses because the cell signal is unreliable and because there are people who do not have cell phones, and the market logic of the carriers never found it profitable enough to care. I had quarters. I dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Bridger Law. Good afternoon. The voice was young, direct, without the polish of a trained receptionist. Good afternoon. My name is Dorothea Hargrove. I was referred by Arthur Mendon in Briar Hill. I have a case that might interest Mr. Bridger. Speaking. I am Colton. I took a breath. It concerns a man who was falsely accused in 1978 of embezzling funds from an agricultural cooperative. He died without the truth being recognized. I found the evidence buried under the floorboards of the house I inherited. And there is a daughter somewhere who has spent her life believing her father was a thief. Brief silence. What kind of evidence? Original documents, meeting minutes with financial inconsistencies, a notarized statement from the man who was coerced into falsifying the records, and a handwritten notebook by the accused himself with dates, names, and a detailed account of how the fraud was orchestrated against him. A longer silence. Are you in Briar Hill now? I am. Can you get to Joplin by tomorrow morning? I looked at the gas station, at the road, at the hills in the distance. I had no ride, no money for a bus. I had the sack on my shoulder and the determination of a person who had not turned back yet. I can. 8 o'clock. Bring everything you found. He paused. There is a motel on Route 71 south of town. The Clover. Tell them I sent you. They will let you pay when you can. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. I have not seen the documents. Colton Bridger met me at 8 sharp in a 2-room office above a hardware store near the Joplin bus terminal. He opened the door himself. No receptionist. The space was small, functional, with a desk buried under case files and a potted fern near the window that was alive but needed water. He shook my hand firmly and indicated the chair. He was in his early 30s, thin, with wireframe glasses and hair that looked like it had been combed with his fingers on the walk from the car. His shirt was pressed, but his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, which told me he cared about presentation, but did not have time to spare on vanity. The stack of files on the desk was not decoration. This man worked. Mendon called last night, he said. Gave me the outline. But I would rather hear it from you. I told it again, this time more precisely, with less emotion and more sequence, because I had spent the night at the Clover Motel organizing in my head exactly what I would say. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The documents, he said. I opened the tin. Colton Bridger spent 40 minutes handling the material with nitrile gloves. He pulled from a desk drawer, which surprised me in the right way, because it showed he had anticipated the nature of what I was bringing. He used a magnifying glass and a small flashlight that cast angled light across the paper, revealing the texture of the ink and the contours of the signatures. He read every document. He opened every fold of the notebook with the care of someone who knows that old paper does not forgive a tear. He examined the coins I had brought as a precaution, though they were secondary to the legal purpose. While he worked, I stayed quiet. I had learned that silence is sometimes the strongest argument you have. That filling space with words when the other person is concentrating is a form of anxiety that hurts the speaker more than it helps. When he finished, he removed the gloves, folded them, placed them on the desk, and sat looking at the notebook. The Pomeroy statement, he said. Mendon told me Virgil Pomeroy is dead. He is. But the statement has a notary seal, County of Christian 1980. If the county clerk's office still has the original register, and clerk's offices are required to retain records indefinitely, the seal can be verified. The signature can be authenticated. Something shifted inside me, not excitement, something more cautious, a crack of light where a door was beginning to open. Is it enough for a case? For a posthumous rehabilitation, we need a petitioner with legal standing. Lucille Fenton, the daughter. Do you know where she is? No. Mendon says he does. Mendon knows a lot of things he does not say out loud. There was a gentle irony in that. No resentment. I will call him. And the cost. He looked at me directly. How much do you have? I did not look away. Less than enough for anything. He was quiet a moment. Then I will be honest with you, he said. A posthumous rehabilitation has court costs. They are not ruinous, but they exist. There is the cost of locating and authenticating documents at the Christian County Clerk's office. There is the cost of a potential handwriting analysis if the Kessler family challenges the authenticity of the notebook. There is my time. He paused. My time I can handle differently. Cases like this, when they succeed, generate a recognized legal precedent. That has value for my practice that goes beyond a fee. I am not doing this out of pure altruism, but I am not doing it out of greed either. I appreciated the honesty. The initial filing costs, I said. How much? He calculated silently. With the clerk's office and the basic filings, about $250 to start. $250. I had in the bottom of my wallet $44.60. I had counted it the night before at the motel, sitting on the edge of the bed, because knowing exactly how much you have is less frightening than not knowing. I need a little time to arrange it, I said. That is fine. The material can stay here if you prefer. I have a safe. I looked at the tin at the notebook. Leaving them with a man I had known for less than an hour was a gamble on instinct that I could not prove with logic. But there had been something in the way Colton Bridger handled those documents, with gloves, with a magnifying glass, with the gravity of a man who understood he was touching something that could not be undone, that told me he grasped the weight of what he held. The notebook and documents stay, I said. The coins come with me. He nodded, as though it was exactly what he would have expected me to say. I returned to Briar Hill that afternoon on a mail carrier's truck, whose driver, a woman named Patsy, who had been running the road for 22 years, talked steadily for the entire 90-minute drive about her daughter's wedding plans, her husband's bad knee, and the price of diesel, none of which required my participation beyond the occasional nod, which suited me fine because my mind was elsewhere. $250. I went to the only person in Briar Hill likely to know anything about old coins. The pharmacist directed me to a man named Harlan Suttles, retired postmaster, who had turned his back room into a private museum of objects the world had discarded. Stamps, old banknotes, coins, stopped clocks, and cigarette lighters arranged in glass cases with handwritten labels. The room smelled like furniture polish and accumulated time. Harlan examined the coins with a jeweler's loupe fitted over his right eye for a period that tested my patience, but that I respected, because I knew haste would not serve anyone in that room. When he finished, he removed the loupe and looked at me. Where did you get these? Inheritance, I said, which was the simplest and truest answer. Most of these are common, not worth much individually. But these 4 here are a different matter. He separated 4 coins from the group. This is an 1893 Morgan silver dollar in very fine condition. This is a 1909 S. Lincoln cent key date. These 2 are Indian head pennies with mint errors that make them interesting to a collector. What would they be worth? He did a silent calculation. The 4 together. I can give you 600. At a proper auction house in Kansas City, they would bring more, but that takes time and a broker. $600. $250 for Colton. $350 remaining, enough for food, for roofing tin, for seed. The others, I said, common dates, common grades, maybe $40 for the lot, $40 for the common ones, $600 for the 4 specials, $640 total. That is correct. Done. I was back in Joplin 2 days later, with an envelope containing $250 in cash that Harlan Suttles had counted twice before handing over. Colton looked at the envelope with an expression that mixed respect with something close to surprise. That was fast, he said. I did not have the option of being slow. He put the money away without comment, wrote a receipt, handed it to me. I called Mendon, he said. Lucille Fenton lives in Tulsa. She is 66 years old, works as a laundry aide at a hospital. Mendon says the last known address is from last year, so it may be outdated, but it is a start. Does she know I exist? Not yet. How do we reach her? I will send a formal letter as her father's attorney of record for the rehabilitation petition. It is the proper channel. If she responds, we schedule a conversation. He looked at me. It may take weeks, sometimes months. A letter from a lawyer about a dead father can frighten a person before it comforts them. I nodded, and while we wait, I authenticate what I can. I contact the Christian County clerk. I start building the timeline. He crossed his arms. And you go back to the hill and live your life because the process will move whether you are sitting in my office or not. I will call you when there is news. Do you have a phone number? I gave him Geneva's number, which he had offered without my asking during a visit earlier that week, saying only that if I ever needed anything, I should come down to the bend, and her door was open, which was the kind of sentence that in the mouths of certain people is not a pleasantry, but a structural commitment. Go home, Colton said. Rest. I'm not tired. Mrs. Hargrove, you have bags under your eyes that reach your chin. A laugh escaped me. Small, brief, real. The kind that comes when you are not expecting it, and that for exactly that reason feels like proof that something inside you has not been completely extinguished. Take care of the documents, I said, standing. I will. Go. The weeks that followed were the quietest I had known since before Earl got sick. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that happens when something important is moving in the background, and the foreground asks only for the simple labor of staying alive. I patched the roof. Harlan Suttles, who turned out to know everyone in the county, sent me to a man named Roy Jessup at the building supply in Briar Hill. A man who measured distances by eye and mixed mortar by hand, and who had learned his trade without a classroom. Roy sold me enough corrugated panels to cover the worst gaps at a price he called the neighbor rate, which I understood to mean the rate for people who cannot afford the real rate, but whose pride should not be tested by charity. He showed me how to climb safely, how to find the leak by the shadow it cast on the underside of the deck, how to seat a panel without cracking the one beside it. I cleared the yard. Earl's chisel was too fine a tool for brushwork, but the kitchen knife and a machete Roy lent me without being asked got the ironweed and thistle down to stubble. I planted with seeds Geneva brought in a small plastic bag tied with a rubber band. Cilantro, green onions, and a tomato start, she said, was cold hardy enough for the ridge. I tended that small plot the way you tend the only thing you have, because at that moment it was literally part of the only thing I had. Geneva came by most mornings with something: a jar of preserves, a sack of cornmeal, once a bar of lye soap wrapped in a page from the farmer's almanac. She never stayed long. She never asked about the documents or the lawyer or what I was doing in town those days I disappeared down the hill. She simply arrived, left what she had brought, exchanged a few sentences about weather or garden pests, and went back down the path with the unhurried gait of a woman who has arranged her life to contain exactly as much as she can carry, and not 1 ounce more. One afternoon, as I was stacking the last of the brush I had cleared, I found on my porch a paper sack containing 4 jars of home-canned green beans and a note in handwriting I did not recognize. No name, just the words, "Glad somebody is looking after the place." I never found out who left it. I did not need to. It was enough to know that the hill had noticed I was there. Colton called on a Thursday evening 3 weeks into the waiting. Geneva herself walked up to tell me, moving faster than her usual pace, which told me before she spoke that the news had weight. I climbed to her kitchen and dialed back. He answered on the first ring. 2 things he said. First, the Christian County clerk confirmed the Pomeroy notarization. Original register page 147, dated October 1980. The seal matches. The signature can be authenticated. We have a verified document. I leaned against Geneva's kitchen wall and closed my eyes. Second, he said. Lucille called. The air in the room changed. She received the letter. She said she could not finish reading it for 2 days because she could not bear it. She said she wants to come. She wants to see the house. She wants to see you. Whenever you will have her. I opened my eyes. Soon I said, "The sooner the better." There was a pause. "One more thing. Have you had any contact with the Kessler family since we last spoke?" "No." "Why?" "Because they will know about the filing soon. The petition is a matter of public record once it is entered. And people like the Kesslers have people who watch the public record." I understood what he was not saying. "I will be careful," I said. "Be more than careful," he said. "Be aware. There is a difference." The visit came 10 days later, not Lucille, the other ones. I was in the garden in the late afternoon pulling weeds from around the tomato start that had finally taken hold when I heard the sound of a vehicle climbing the dirt road. Not the wheezing rattle of Roy's truck or the mail carrier's van. A smooth, heavy engine. The sound money makes when it moves. I stood up, wiped my hands on my work pants, walked to the gate. A black SUV was parked on the shoulder just below the property. The windows were tinted. The tires were the oversized kind that belong on pavement, not on dirt roads, which meant whoever was driving had come here on purpose and did not care about the mud. Two people stood at the gate. One was a man in his 20s, broad-shouldered, standing slightly behind and to the left with the posture of someone whose job is presence, not conversation. The other was a woman. She was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back, gray blazer over a white blouse, which was an aggressive choice for a dirt road in the Ozarks, and therefore deliberate. Her face was composed in an expression I recognized immediately, the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is confident it will work. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was controlled, measured, calibrated to project authority without raising volume. "You must be Mrs. Hargrove." "I am." "And this is my property." "Of course." "My name is Margot Aldrich. I am an attorney representing the interests of the Kessler family." The Kessler family. The name from the notebook. The name that had moved through Wallace Fenton's pages like a shadow that never quite showed its full shape. I did not change my expression. I had learned that the first thing a person with power looks for in the face of a person without power is the signal of fear. If they find it, they advance. If they do not, they recalculate. What does the Kessler family want with me? "We understand you have come into possession of certain historical materials found on the property." She paused. The way someone pauses when they are giving you time to volunteer information. I did not. Materials that relate to a sensitive period in this community's history. The family recognizes the potential historical value of these materials and would like to make a generous offer for their acquisition. Acquisition of the materials, I said, or the property. The materials primarily, though there may be room to discuss the property as well if there is mutual interest. I looked at her. I looked at the man behind her. I looked at the black SUV. "The materials you are referring to," I said with the calm I had learned to manufacture when anger needed to stay stored, "are in the custody of an attorney in Joplin for the purposes of a legal proceeding." The composure on Margot Aldrich's face held, but something behind it shifted. A tightening around the eyes that lasted less than a second. "Are you certain that is the path you want to take, Mrs. Hargrove? Legal proceedings of this nature can be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain in outcome. And in areas like this, old cases have a way of complicating the lives of the people who pursue them." It was a threat constructed with words chosen precisely so it could never be called a threat. I knew that distinction. I had lived inside it. "Thank you for coming." "Ms. Aldrich," I said, "if your clients wish to communicate further, they can contact my attorney directly. I can provide the information." She did not move immediately. For a moment, something crossed her face that did not match the rehearsed script. It was brief, unguarded, and I almost missed it. But it was there. A flicker of something that might have been recognition. Not of me specifically, of the situation, of what she was doing, and what it looked like from the other side of the gate. Then it was gone. She reached into her blazer, produced a business card, and held it out. In case you reconsider, I did not take the card. I opened the gate just wide enough to step inside, then closed it behind me. Good afternoon, I said. I did not look back. I listened. Footsteps retreating on gravel. Car doors closing. The engine starting. The SUV descending the road without haste, without spinning tires, with the deliberate calm of people who want you to understand that their departure was a choice, not a defeat. Only then did I stop. I was standing in the middle of my yard with the late sun falling across the sycamore and my heart beating harder than I had allowed my face to show at the gate. I thought about Wallace Fenton living in this same house alone for years, knowing there were people who preferred his evidence to stay buried, writing anyway, hiding the documents anyway. With a hand that grew shakier but never stopped, I went inside. I lit the wood stove. I put water on. And while the kettle heated, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, at the tomato plant, at the row of green onion shoots just beginning to show. And I thought about what Colton had said. Be more than careful. Be aware. I was aware. That night I slept lightly, not from fear, but from the particular alertness of a body that knows it is being watched. Sometime past midnight I woke to a sound outside. Footsteps on the gravel path moving slowly, trying not to be heard. I reached for the chisel, moved to the window. Through the gap in the shutters, I could see in the white light of a nearly full moon a figure at the gate, male, young, crouching at the latch, not trying to open it, doing something to it, packing something into the hasp. I went out the back door, crossed the yard along the shadow of the wall, came around the corner. Who is there? I said. Not a shout, a voice pitched to carry without sounding afraid. He spun, 20-something, wide-eyed. Something metal in one hand, a small pry tool. We stared at each other for a single beat. Then he dropped the tool, vaulted the low section of the fence, and ran down the hill. I stood in the moonlight, listening until his footsteps faded entirely. Then I went to the gate. The latch was intact. He had not had enough time. But wedged into the hasp was a dark paste, some kind of compound. Something meant to jam the mechanism to make the gate impossible to open from inside. I cleaned it out with a stick, threw the residue into the weeds, went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table with the chisel in front of me and felt the anger. The specific anger of a person who has been threatened inside her own space. Anger that someone had calculated I was alone enough for this to work. Anger that the calculation was probably correct. But alongside the anger there was clarity. This confirmed what Colton had said. People who are in the right do not need to buy silence. They do not send young men to jam locks in the dark. The Kesslers were afraid, and afraid people make mistakes. In the morning I walked into Briar Hill and filed a notarized affidavit at the county clerk's office describing what had happened. Time-date description of the man, the substance found in the latch. The clerk looked at me with the expression of a person who would prefer not to be involved, but she processed the document because I stood at the counter and did not leave until it was done. I called Colton from the gas station payphone, told him everything. When I finished, there was a silence I recognized as the silence of a person reassessing the scale of what they are dealing with. "Are you safe?" he said first. "I am." The affidavit was smart. "I am learning from the process." A pause. Then his voice changed. Less attorney, more direct. "Mrs. Hargrove. Dot. This is not proportional to a rehabilitation petition. They are not this worried about a dead man's reputation. There is something else. Something in those land records that we have not found yet. And when we find it, I think it will explain why they are this desperate." I looked through the glass of the phone booth at the single blinking traffic light at the courthouse square, at the quiet town that held a 40-year secret in its foundations, the way the house on the hill had held it under its floor. "Find it," I said. "I am already looking." And Dot. His voice shifted. "Take care of yourself up there. This is not just paper anymore." I know I said. It never was. I hung up. Stood in the booth for a moment. then walked out into the morning light of Briar Hill, past the pharmacy, past the diner with the broken screen door, past the church with the white steeple that caught the sun and threw a shadow all the way across the street. And I thought about Wallace Fenton alone on that hill, writing by lamplight, hiding the truth in the only vault he trusted, believing that someday someone would come along who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. He had been right, and whatever they were hiding, whatever the land records held that made the Kesslers desperate enough to send a stranger to my gate in the dark, Colton would find it. I was certain of that. The way I was certain of few things in my life, not because I trusted the system, not because I believed justice was inevitable, but because I had learned in the months since I first knelt on that floor and heard the hollow sound beneath the wood that the truth does not stay buried forever. It only stays buried until someone decides that keeping it underground costs more than letting it rise. And that cost for me had already been paid. The answer came 3 weeks later, and it was worse than I expected, which meant it was also better. Colton had hired a documentary researcher in Jefferson City who spent 2 weeks pulling land records, probate filings, and cooperative incorporation papers from county archives across 3 jurisdictions. The researcher found what the Kesslers had been afraid of, and it was not just a dead man's reputation. Colton explained it over the phone in a voice that was trying to stay organized, while the information it carried kept pulling toward outrage. The contract was a fabrication, not partially, entirely. A sale agreement dated 1984, 1 year after Wallace Fenton's death, purporting to transfer the Fenton property to Randall Kessler, the family patriarch. The notary whose seal appeared on the contract had died in 1982, 2 years before the date on the document. The man who had allegedly signed on behalf of the Fenton estate had filed a sworn statement in a different county declaring he had no connection to the estate whatsoever. And the registration number in the tiny county records did not correspond to any real document from that period. But there was more. Wallace Fenton's land had not been only the 9 acres where the house stood. Attached to the original parcel was a 48-acre tract that had been registered collectively in the name of the cooperative. When the cooperative collapsed, that land had fallen into a legal gray area, unassigned, unclaimed, suspended in the bureaucratic silence that swallows things when no one is left to fight for them. In 1985, 1 year after the forged contract, the Kessler family had incorporated those 48 acres into their holdings, using that same forged document as the basis for the transfer. 48 acres of Ozark Hill country, with a year-round spring identified in the 1976 Geological Survey, bordering the state highway that had been built in the 1990s and now served as the primary corridor for agricultural transport in the region. Land that today, according to the researcher's conservative estimate, was worth well over $2 million. Taken with a piece of paper built on the destruction of a man who had done nothing wrong. I stood in Geneva's kitchen holding the phone and said nothing for a long time after Colton finished. So it was never about his name, I said finally. His name was the tool. The land was the purpose. Colton's voice had the dry quality of someone who has reached a conclusion that is not surprising, but is heavy all the same. They destroyed a man so they could take what was his. The notebook, the documents, if they surface, they do not just clear Wallace. They invalidate the 1984 transfer. They bring 48 acres of land back into dispute. They unravel 40 years of ownership built on a forged foundation. That is why $15,000 was cheap for them. That is why someone came to your gate at midnight. I looked out Geneva's window at the dirt path climbing toward my house, at the cedars bending in the wind, at the ridgeline dark against the October sky. And what happens now? Now the case changes shape, Colton said. It is no longer just a rehabilitation petition. It is annulment of a fraudulent contract recovery of misappropriated land and referral to the county prosecutor for document fraud. I am filing with the State Attorney General's office this week. This is too large for a county court alone. Does Lucille know? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. Tell her I said. She has waited long enough to learn the full truth. She should not have to wait for the law to catch up. Lucille Fenton Yates arrived on a Saturday morning in the first week of November. She came by bus to Briar Hill, and from there in Geraldo's taxi, the only taxi in town, a dented sedan driven by a man who had been ferrying people up and down these roads for 30 years, and who knew without being told which passengers needed quiet and which needed conversation. He gave Lucille the quiet. I was stacking firewood beside the porch when I heard the car door close at the bottom of the hill. I set down the split log, wiped my hands, walked to the gate. She appeared at the bend in the trail, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing a navy blue coat buttoned to the collar against the November wind. 66 years old, medium height, slightly stooped at the shoulders the way a body becomes when it has spent decades bent over institutional laundry machines in hospital basements. Her hair was gray, pulled back in a low knot. Her clothes were simple, maintained with the care of a person who knows the value of appearing composed because she cannot afford to appear otherwise. She stopped when she saw me. I have spent a long time thinking about what was on her face in that moment, and I still do not have the precise word. It was not relief. Relief comes after. This was the instant before relief, the tense and fragile space between carrying and setting down when you are not yet sure the ground will hold. Mrs. Hargrove. The voice was steady on the surface, but there was a vibration beneath it like a wire pulled taut and plucked. Lucille, come in. I made coffee. It is what you do. It is what you do in any house where someone arrives from far away carrying something heavy. You make coffee, you set it on the table, you sit down and you let the coffee and the silence do the work that immediate words cannot. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the cup and looked at the wood grain for a long time without speaking. The wind outside, the sound of the cedars, the tomato vines long since finished for the season tapping against the garden fence in the breeze. I never came back, she said at last. Not as accusation, as confession. After I left at 16, I never returned, not even to bury him. I sent a cousin. I said nothing. I was angry, she continued. Not just ashamed of what people said. Angry at him for letting it happen, for staying here alone instead of coming after me, for dying without explaining anything. She lifted her eyes to mine. And then a letter arrives from a lawyer saying my father left proof buried under the floor that he was innocent and that a woman who never knew him is the one who found it. I held her gaze. I did not try to fill the silence. How does a person hold that, she said. How do you hold 40 years of believing one thing and then finding out it was wrong and that the person you blamed was the one who spent his last years trying to reach you? I do not know how the daughter holds it, I said. I only know how the person who found the proof holds it. She holds it as a responsibility she did not ask for, and a certainty that she cannot do anything else. Lucille looked at me for a long moment. Then she set the cup down and stood. Can I see? I took her to the front room. The plank was still loose, resting in its frame, but unfixed. I had left it that way deliberately, because it seemed important not to seal that space as though it were merely a piece of flooring, and not the place where a man had stored the only true version of his own life. Lucille knelt on the floor. She lifted the plank with her own hands. She looked down into the dark cavity at the turned earth, at the empty space where the leather pouch and the tin had rested for decades. She did not speak for a long time. She simply knelt there, looking into that darkness beneath the wood where her father had buried the truth, and waited for someone to come. He was waiting for me, she said, more to herself than to me. All those years, he was waiting for me to come home. I stood behind her at a respectful distance and let the moment be what it needed to be. She was right. The notebook had been written for her. The last page had been addressed to whoever found it. But the plea, do this for her, not for me, had always been about Lucille. I was only the vehicle, and realizing that did not make me feel smaller. It made me feel precisely placed, the way a piece fits when you finally see where it belongs. She lowered the plank back into position, rose, turned to me with eyes that were wet, but a face that was composed the composure of a woman who learned decades ago not to fall apart in front of others, and who carries that discipline even now, even here, even when falling apart might be the most honest thing to do. The lawyer explained the process, she said. I will sign whatever is needed. It may take time, I said. The Kesslers will fight it. Let them. There was something in her voice that was older than anger. The resolve of a person who has waited half a lifetime for the chance to stop swallowing. I am 66 years old. I spent every one of those years carrying a name that people used as a synonym for thief. I do not care how long it takes. Lucille stayed 2 days. We talked. Not only about the case, about everything. About her 40 years in Tulsa, the hospital laundry, the husband who died of a heart attack 15 years ago, the two grown sons who never understood why their mother refused to speak about their grandfather. About Wallace, the fragments she still carried from before everything collapsed. The smell of turned earth he brought in when he came from the fields. The stories he told at night about the grandfather and the great-grandfather who had cleared this land. The way the house used to feel when it was full of a family instead of silence. She told me about the day she left. 16, a paper sack of clothes, a bus ticket she had paid for with money saved from babysitting. The look on his face when she walked down the hill. She had not turned around. Had carried the image of that look for 50 years without ever going back to check if it had changed. On the second night, sitting at the table long after the lamp should have been turned down, she told me something that stopped me. You know what you did, she said, what I did. You could have sold everything and stayed quiet. No one would have known. No one would have held you to account. I would have known. Exactly. She looked at me with dark eyes that held something of a father in them. Or so I imagine, never having seen the man. It is easy to do the right thing when someone is watching. It is the hardest thing in the world when the only witness is yourself. The morning she left, we walked together down to the road. The November air was sharp and clean. The trail smelling of frost and fallen leaves with that early light the Ozarks get in autumn that makes everything look newly made. She carried the overnight bag and a parcel I had wrapped the night before. A handwritten copy of the most important pages from her father's notebook. Not the originals those were with Colton, but the words, his handwriting, what he had needed to say. I thought she deserved to hold that in her hands, not only in her memory. Halfway down, she stopped and looked at the woods beside the trail, not at anything specific, at the whole of it. The tall oaks, the understory of redbud and dogwood, the light filtering through bare branches. He loved this, she said. The hills. He used to say the land remembers everything that happens on it. It does, I said. She looked at me with an expression I could not name immediately. Later I could. It was gratitude without ceremony. The kind that cannot be repaid, and that for exactly that reason does not try to present itself as something negotiable. Thank you, she said. And I, who had trained myself to swallow every tightness in the throat, as a reflex felt a pressure behind my eyes that was different from all the other pressures. It was not the kind that comes from loss. It came from the opposite. The ruling came on a Wednesday in December. Colton called Geneva's phone, and Geneva came up the path faster than I had ever seen her move both hands on her hat, to keep the wind from taking it, with an expression that said everything her words had not yet. I climbed to her kitchen, dialed. Colton picked up before the second ring. All 3 counts, he said. Posthumous rehabilitation of Wallace Eugene Fenton granted. The 1984 contract declared null and void on grounds of documentary fraud. And the state attorney general has filed formal charges against 2 members of the Kessler family for land fraud and falsification of public records. I closed my eyes. The 48 acres are frozen pending the criminal investigation. No sale, no transfer, no encumbrance until the case concludes. When it does, and it will. The evidence is overwhelming. The land reverts to Wallace Fenton's estate, which means it goes to Lucille. I leaned against the wall, Through the window, I could see the ridge, the bare trees, the gray sky promising the first real cold of winter. Does she know you are the first person I called? I wanted you to hear it before anyone. Why? Because without you, there is no filing, no petition, no evidence, no case. He paused. This is the most important work I have done. I wanted the person who made it possible to know first. I stood in Geneva's kitchen, holding the phone and looking at the light on the hills, and could not speak for a moment. Then I said what needed to be said. Call Lucille, I said. She has waited longer than anyone. Lucille came back in January, and this time she did not come alone. With her came Renato, her eldest son, 40 years old, with his mother's quiet manner and deep-set eyes. He stood in my kitchen looking at the plank in the floor, at the walls, at the land through the window, with the expression of a man who is seeing for the first time a place he has heard about his entire life but never believed he would visit. My mother never talked about this place, he said. Now I understand why. And now I understand why she needs to. Lucille sat at my table holding the court order, the certified document that formally declared her father innocent. And she did not read it again because she had already read it enough times for the words to live inside her. She simply held it the way you hold something that has finally arrived after you stopped believing it would. What will you do with the land? I asked. Renato wants to start a small cooperative, she said, a quiet smile. The kind that appears when an idea is still young but already has a shape. He says it would close the circle, finish what his great-grandfather began. Wallace would have liked that. I know. She looked down at the document in her hands. I went to the cemetery, she said, before coming here. The gravestone is plain, just his name and the dates. No photograph, no flowers, nothing to show that anyone remembered. There is something now, I said. She looked up. Yes, there is. Before they left, Lucille asked to be alone in the front room. I went out to the yard with Renato and the cold January wind and left the door open. It was not my place to decide what she needed to say or do in that space. It was hers. When she came out 10 minutes later, her eyes were red, but her face was calm. The calm that is not absence of pain, but presence of peace, even with the pain still there beside it. She embraced me at the gate. Not the social kind, the kind that has weight and intention, the kind that tries to transfer something that does not fit in words. This house, she said, her face near my shoulder. My father would have wanted to know it was in good hands. The months that followed moved with the slow certainty of seasons on a hill where nobody hurries. Spring came wet, turning the red clay trail to mud and filling the creek at the bottom of the hollow with water loud enough to hear from the porch. I replanted the garden, expanded it, added lettuce and kale and a row of pole beans along the fence that Colton, who had driven up one weekend in April with no legal reason, and a six-pack of root beer, helped me string wire, for while we talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Geneva still came most mornings. She brought less now because I needed less. But she came because the visits had stopped being about provisions and had become about the thing that provisions had been a stand-in for all along. One morning in May, she arrived with a woman I did not know, younger, mid-30s, carrying a heavy backpack and a smaller bag pressed against her chest. There was a bruise along the left side of her jaw, yellowed at the edges, in the stage of healing. That is worse to look at than the fresh injury because it has lost the excuse of immediacy, but still tells the whole story without a word. Geneva looked at me with those measuring eyes. This is Jolene. She needs a place for a few days. I did not ask anything more. Come in, I said. There is coffee on the stove. Jolene stayed longer than a few days. She stayed because the few days became a week, and the week became a month, and the month became the time it takes for a person who left everything behind in the middle of the night to find out what shape her life will take when she starts building it again from the ground. I did not offer advice. I did not offer solutions that were not asked for. I offered what the house offered: space. Quiet when quiet was needed. Work when work helped, because I had learned that physical labor occupies the part of the brain that otherwise loops the same wound over and over without arriving anywhere new. After Jolene, there was a man named Dale, 57, a mason who had built walls and foundations for 3 decades and had lost his footing in the same slow way the cooperative had dissolved one piece at a time until what remained could not support what had been. The taxi driver Geraldo brought him to my gate on a Tuesday afternoon, explaining only that there was nowhere else in the county with room for this kind of situation. I did not ask Dale if he wanted to stay. I asked if he was hungry. He was. He ate. He stayed. Within a month, he had rebuilt the sagging section of the porch with stone he hauled from the old quarry up the ridge, setting each piece with a precision that spoke of hands remembering what they were made for. The house filled, not all at once, not in a rush, the way water finds its level. On a night in November, 1 year to the week since I had first climbed that hill with the cardboard suitcase and the blanket that smelled like mothballs, I sat on the porch after everyone else had gone to sleep. The air was cold and sharp with the mineral smell of limestone and the faint sweetness of the last fallen leaves decomposing into the soil. From inside the house came the low sound of someone shifting in sleep. A floorboard responding with a creak that was ordinary now. The creak of a house that held people instead of secrets. The sky above the Ozarks was the thing I will remember longest about this place. No electric light for miles, no glow on the horizon. Just the dark and the stars, so many and so close that they seemed excessive, as though whoever had made them had overestimated the amount of beauty one sky could reasonably contain. The Milky Way ran from one edge of the darkness to the other, a pale, dense river of light that had been there every night I looked, but that I had not truly seen until now. Earl used to stand in the yard of our rented house in Springfield and look up. The yard was small, and the sky was the washed-out orange of urban sodium lights, but he looked anyway. I asked him once what he was checking for. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Just making sure it is all still there." I had not understood then. I understood now. It was not distrust of the universe. It was not fear that the stars might dissolve if no one witnessed them. It was the need to connect with something permanent when everything temporary keeps leaving too fast. The act of saying silently and without words, "I know there is something larger than my specific trouble, and that does not make my trouble smaller, but it helps me carry it." I looked up. It was all still there. I went inside. The front room was dark except for the faint glow of the wood stove through the grate. I knelt beside the plank in the floor, the wide dark board that I had never nailed down, not as a memorial and not as a symbol, but as an honesty. An acknowledgement that this space had existed, had held what it needed to hold, had been opened when the time was right, and that the earth beneath it was now empty, and that empty is not absence. Empty is room. Room is where things begin. I pressed my palm flat against the wood. It was cool and smooth and silent. No hollow sound, no creaking. The house had said what it needed to say a long time ago, and had been quiet ever since, not with the anxious silence of waiting, but with the settled silence of something that knows its work is done. I thought about Wallace Fenton writing by lamplight in this room. His hand unsteady on the last pages, the ink fainter, the letters less sure, but the meaning never wavering. "If you have any kindness in you, do this for her." I had done it, and in doing it, I had discovered something he probably did not intend to teach, but that was buried in his request the same way the documents were buried beneath the floor. That kindness is not a resource you deplete by using. It is a resource that generates more of itself. That helping someone else stand up teaches you how to stand. That finding the story of a man who was buried unjustly teaches you not to let them bury yours. I rose, went to the kitchen, opened the notebook I had bought at the Briar Hill General Store months ago, the one where I had been writing since the early weeks, not with the intention of keeping a record, but because some things need a shape outside of you in order to fully exist. I turned to the last page I had written and added one line beneath it. I did not inherit a house. I inherited a door. and the only thing worth doing with a door is opening it. I closed the notebook, turned down the lamp, lay in the dark listening to the house breathing around me, the wind in the cedar trees. The wood stove ticking as it cooled the silence beneath the floorboards, where the truth had rested for 40 years until the right person knelt down and listened. Outside, the stars were doing what they have always done, staying. Permanent and indifferent and impossibly beautiful, verifying every night for anyone willing to look that some things endure, that the land remembers, that the floor gives back what was given to it, that the door once opened does not need to close again. Have you ever found something hidden that changed the way you understood someone you lost? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that. The truth, no matter how long it has been buried, will always find its way back to the light.